In my previous two videos of this HTML series, we covered what HTML is, and then we also covered what elements are and how those kind of work. But there's one missing part of elements that we haven't talked about, and that is attributes. And that is what this video is going to be about. So, diving into what attributes are and kind of how they work, elements can also have attributes. Attributes look like the following. So, right here, we have a opening p tag, a closing p tag, and some content. So this is our overall element right here. But within the opening tag here, we have what's called an attribute. So this is saying class is equal to, and then a string editor hyphen note. And what this is doing is attributes contain extra information about the element that won't appear in the content. In this example, the class attribute is an identifying name used to target the element with style information. So here we're setting a class editor note, and then we might use CSS to target this element and use a selector that selects elements that have a class of editor note and apply some styles to this element. So it provides some extra information that this isn't going to appear in your web document. It's not going to appear in the content of your page here. It's just extra information. Now, there's a couple of things that an attribute should have. So an attribute should have a space between it and the element name. And then it also goes on to say for an element with more than one attribute, the attribute should be separated by spaces too. So you see the element name right here as P, and then there's a space and then your attribute. And then if you add another attribute following the string, you would have another space, and then you'd write out that attribute, all within the opening tag of this element. The attribute name followed by an equal sign, so assigning the attribute to something. And we'll talk about Boolean attributes later in this video. An attribute value wrapped with opening and closing quote marks. So an attribute within quote right here. Okay. But now moving forward into Boolean attributes, as I just alluded to, sometimes you'll see attributes written without values. This is entirely acceptable. These are called Boolean attributes. Boolean attributes can only have one value, which is generally the same as the attribute name. For example, consider the disabled attribute, which you can assign to form input elements. You would use this to disable the form element so someone couldn't make entries. So one way you could write this is for this input, you're setting the disabled attribute here equal to the string disabled. So this would make this input disabled. The user wouldn't be able to make their entries within this input. But as a shorthand, it's acceptable to write it this way, in which you have input of type text, and then you just place the disabled attribute here without assigning it a value with equal sign and then some string. And this is basically just setting disabled to true here, saying it is disabled. And then to re-enable this here, you just wouldn't place a disabled attribute at all on your input. And then in this example here, it shows these would be two disabled inputs that they're kind of grayed out, and the outline is a little bit subdued. And then this one would be an input in which you can actually have entries in. But now let's move to omitting quotes around attribute values. So if you look at code for a lot of other sites, you might come across a number of strange markup styles, including attribute values without quotes. This is permitted in certain circumstances, but it can also break your markup in other circumstances. For example, if we revisit our link example from earlier, we could write a basic version with only the href attribute like this. So here, this is an attribute, and then for this URL here, you see that it's not putting quotes. However, as soon as we add the title attribute in this way, there are problems. So this is actually going to cause an error. As written above, the browser misinterprets the markup, mistaking the title attribute for three attributes: a title attribute with a value the, and two Boolean attributes, Mozilla and homepage. So it's saying title is equal to the, and then it's thinking that we're trying to set two separate attributes here, just two Boolean attributes, Mozilla and homepage. And this goes on to recommend always include the attribute quotes. It avoids such problems and results in more readable code. So even though you can kind of get away with something like this, it's probably best to just use quotes around the values of your attributes. Now, should you use single or double quotes? So they mentioned in this article, you will notice that attributes are wrapped in double quotes. However, you might see single quotes in some HTML code. This is a matter of style. You can feel free to choose whichever one you prefer, and both are going to be equivalent. Make sure you don't mix single and double quotes, as if you did something like this example here, href equals this URL, in which you start this URL with double quotes and end it with single quotes, that's going to be an error. However, if you use one type of quote, you can include the other type of quote inside your attribute values. So here, when setting this title, isn't this fun? When using the single quote in isn't between the N and the T, that is going to be valid if we wrap our entire value here within double quotes, because it will still understand that within double quotes is our value. And this is just part of our string. But if we started this with a single quote and ended it with a single quote, well, when it hits this single quote here, it's going to think that title is equal to the value of ISN because we end it with this single quote here. And then this would be an error. And this is exactly what they show in this example here. When setting title with single quotes, isn't this fun? When placing an apostrophe in isn't here, it's going to set the value to ISN, and then T this fun is going to be set as like Boolean attributes, which is going to cause an error. So those are the fundamentals of how attributes work. They just go within your opening tags of your HTML, and they provide a little bit of extra information to a certain element that might allow you to style that element, or it might allow the browser to kind of represent that element in different ways or change the behavior of that element, like disabling the element or certain things like that. Okay. So that's kind of the mechanics of how attributes work in HTML. But next, let's move to the anatomy of an HTML document and how all this kind of fits together.